This continues Chapter 5's focus on NEPA, and this is the second of basically 3 videos on NEPA. This one is procedures, but really I'm going to focus on terminology a lot on this one. Once you get the terminology down, then we'll lay out the procedures. I think it's most important that you understand when people use terms such as significance, a significant adverse environmental effect, that you know how you define significance. Then also we need to give you some distinctions among different NEPA documents. What is an environmental assessment versus environmental impact statement? So basic terminology for the National Environmental Policy Act process. Two terms. One is effect. What is the effect? And I just said, geez, we need to determine significant adverse environmental effects versus non-significant adverse environmental effects. The triggering of a NEPA document means you're going to take an action. An action is considered a federal or state action when you expend funds. So when we built the floating piers at Massachusetts Maritime Academy, we expended funds. We took a state action. The Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act kicked in. But as I said, we'll just call it the National Environmental Policy Act, and we'll talk at a federal level. And the expenditure of funds for a Coast Guard station to build a boat ramp or a floating pier, that expenditure of funds is a federal action. So then you ask the question, does that federal action have a significant adverse environmental effect? And for a floating pier at a Coast Guard station, and maybe there's already one there, they made 2, it doesn't hit significance. None of us would say, oh, that's significant, you need an environmental impact statement. Putting 150 wind turbines offshore, yeah, okay, that's going to need an environmental impact statement. Dredging Boston Harbor to 50 feet deep, spending $600 million. Actually, I think it's only 400. But that probably environmental impact statement. Although you argue that you're just dredging deeper in this existing channel and going to the same disposal site. But you look at it and there's a lot of turbidity. So somewhere between it's only a boat ramp or paving the boat parking lot to yeah, you're going to put in 150 wind turbines is the spectrum of effects. The term effects and impacts are they're the same. So you have to ask the question, how does your project, your action, affect the human environment? So the human environment is the natural and physical environment. So you the easiest way in my mind to get what they meant in the National Environmental Policy Act by defining the human environment like this, the easiest way to get your hands around it is it's the non-built environment. The human environment is also called the ecosphere sometimes, but if you're having a physical effect on the water, air, or substrate or biological component of your environment, then you have to consider the significance of that effect on the human environment and decide whether you need an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement. So that's why it's very important to understand it's the human environment effect. You can undertake something by the federal or state government that has a significant economic impact. You can tax, you could change close a business downtown Boston, and or you can the state of Massachusetts can pass some social requirement, and if such as wearing masks, I guess. But if it doesn't have an effect on the productivity or the ecological quality of the natural environment, the human environment as it's called in NEPA, then you do not do a NEPA document. There's several interesting case laws on this. The 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant had an emissions leak and they repaired it. And they went to restart it, and Conservation Law Foundation, CLF is a large nonprofit where a lot of young lawyers that want to get into the field will do pro bono work. They'll volunteer their time, and they're very good at looking at big picture things nationally and having regional chapters spearhead a particular environmental conservation type legal battle. So really good organization, been around a long time, but they're very familiar with NEPA and NEPA processes. They get involved with the pipeline on the Native American property out west. You'll see them in headlines around the country for fracking. So they said, well, wait a minute, you're going to restart 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant. Of course you need an EIS. And the courts went through the whole thing and they said today, in the existence of the plant, it is there and it is permitted to operate, and it has all its footprint. If you throw that switch tomorrow, the exact same situation in the environment will exist. Whether the plant's on or off and has more of a nuclear threat or not, the threat probably is the same whether it's running or not. The nuclear threat, the biggest one is for storage and leaking. So the courts determined that since there was not a new adverse environmental impact to the environment, that NEPA did not apply. Note, this is 83. Take the opposite tact on that, and the Secretary Babbitt, Secretary of Interior, back in the 90s, Secretary Babbitt was really good at preserving, building, making not just preserves, but conservation of property. And they were making more parkland. They were even more than parkland, not just for people recreation. They're making wildlife refuges. So a national wildlife refuge is, there's some, usually you have some fine trails, but there's no hunting. There's no hunting. There's no fishing on many. So it basically, a wildlife refuge means we're going to allow the wildlife to flourish here. And it's the same thing in the marine environment. If you make a refuge or a preserve and you don't allow harvest, then eventually the amount of wildlife is so high, it'll begin to start populating nearby adjacent areas where you can hunt and fish. So it's a great concept, and the only issue was people, especially foresters and hunters in the Pacific Northwest, said, well, wait a minute, you're going to make this conservation area, and we want to see an environmental impact statement because us not being able to hunt or fish is an economic impact, and a social one too, I would imagine. So very clearly the court said no. If you make there is no adverse environmental impact or beneficial environmental impact on the natural environment. You are simply leaving it in the state that it is. So therefore you did not, Department of Interior, did not need environmental impact statements for doing this type of award. So this has evolved a little, and certainly the National Park Service do what they call environmental assessments of infrastructure development on something like this. So if you're going to have a refuge, then often you're going to start building a house, you're going to build roads, and they're not significant. And, if you go to a national wildlife refuge, you always I always like the fact that you have a visitor center with restrooms, water, information. They'll have a first aid, and then they'll have the ranger's office, and it's always very nicely built. It's kind of usually a pervious surface, gravel type lots, and it fits. Especially if you go out to say the Colorados, they really do a good job of it. But it is still an impact, not a significant one. But you have to clear trees. You have to change property from, I guess, grassland to parking land to buildings. So as much as this Department of Interior won this and they could go ahead, then they realized that besides, establishing the preserve on paper, then they always get in there and start doing some physical alterations. But still, a win for the court. Very clearly says if you're preserving the natural environment, you do not need a NEPA analysis. So now there's three types of effects: direct effects, indirect effects, and then cumulative effects. So those three terms you should know when you're dealing with NEPA. Direct effects are simple. You go in and physically build something. You walk in and say, I am going to make a lock-in dam. Here's one of the lock-in dams on, I think it's the Arkansas River. So you're going to build this. So when you build that, you have physical impacts. You have fill in waters of the United States. So you need to comply with the Clean Water Act. There are, all the local laws or the federal laws. If this is going into the coastal zone, you need the Coastal Zone Management Act. But basically, it's a direct effect. Indirect effects are things that could happen elsewhere. So somewhere else on the river, when you build a big navigation feature, when you alter the top of an estuary, and we've seen this in Red Brook, where the top of the river in Red Brook going into Onset Buzzards Bay, they changed the hydrology when they made cranberry bogs. So they changed the hydrology for the cranberry bogs, and that had indirect effects above that area. So this is a classic one where they had indirect effects. They put this dam in, and really far away, there was the backwater, when you put a dam in, you all know the backwater builds up behind it, and about 1,000 acres of wetlands were established because of this. Now, they didn't never even foresee it, but they, way back in the upper watershed, some area impounded, and it was a positive indirect effect. But nowadays, with computer modeling, we should be able to pick out some of these larger indirect effects. So direct caused by the construction, indirect by the alteration in the environment, could be pretty remote from the area. And that's the wetland. So this area was a dry farm field. It was quite a distance away, but they did not see this back in the 80s, or when they probably built this in the 70s. They didn't see these wetlands, so they didn't look at the hydrology. They didn't have the adequate computer modeling. So what you're supposed to do is any reasonably foreseeable indirect effect, you should be predicting. And therefore you look at the watershed, and GIS and computer models make this a lot easier, but this was a classic unknown indirect effect. Then there's the term cumulative effect. So indirect is not during construction, not what the project was built to do, dam water and make a navigation lock. Then, that's not what the project was built for. That was indirect. But cumulative effects are, you look at some type of modern historic benchmark and say, what are the cumulative effects of my project and everybody else's project? I think there's a saying, I'm going to probably get it wrong too, death by 1,000 cuts. Oh yeah, you lose a little here, lose a little there. That actually is what wiped out the scallop industry in coastal Massachusetts. We'll take out some eelgrass beds. This blight came along. Weather conditions. So little by little, the eelgrass beds were lost, and you lost the coastal scallop nursery. So cumulative effects analysis are required. in your NEPA document. So, and you would really have a chapter, and you'll see when we get to the actual uh, terminology and chapters and process, you'll have a chapter that says environmental impacts, and you should organize it into direct effects, indirect effects, and cumulative effects. One of the most fascinating cumulative effects analysis I've seen is NOAA asked the federal government, Army Corps, and state governments, local jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act, to do a cumulative impact analysis on all of the beach nourishment and coastal beach development for recreation in the Gulf of Mexico, which on the Florida Panhandle is huge. You know, there's a lot of resorts there. But all of the coastal beach development, and you will call it that, whether you're restoring the beach, building, parking lots nearby, or just bringing people to the beach, but all of the restoration in Coast Beach on sea turtles, all of the endangered sea turtles. And I thought that was brilliant. No one has done it. It's almost impossible to do. It would be huge. But if you take the modern historic time of even the 50s, before World War II, not everybody had a car in the driveway. And after World War II, everybody had a car in the driveway. And hey, where do you want to go? We're going to go to the beach. So after World War II, and let's say you go back to even before World War II, we go to the 30s, we would have knowledge of the development along the coast. And then you compare that to all of the permits issued in the coastal zone in the Gulf of Mexico that may impact sea turtles, all the species. Then would you say, and this is why no one wants to touch this, would we be able to issue one more permit? Because more than likely 50% or more of the turtle nesting population has been adversely impacted. So why would we be able to justify more of an impact? And, that's maybe an esoteric discussion, but there are social needs, recreational needs, economic needs, and people like their beaches. But if you take it from the Endangered Species Act perspective, or you take it from even the Fish and Wildlife Service responsibility and NOAA's responsibility to maintain an adequate sea turtle population, maybe you shouldn't issue any permits for anything. But no one has taken that on. There's a few other cases like that, big scale cumulative impacts. In Boston Harbor dredging, we had to consider the cumulative impacts of all the dredging and disposal in all of the region. So when you run a regional ocean disposal site, which there are several around New England, we'll see them one of these days. When you look at that, you'll have to say, what are the cumulative impacts? And it's another way to put the question is, do you have enough room at the town dump for all the future disposal? And an ocean disposal site for dredge material, I always consider the town dump of dredge material out of harbors. You want to dredge. You don't want ships hitting bottom. You don't want oil spills. So you got to put the dredge material somewhere. What are the cumulative impacts? And, just look at 50 years. What are the cumulative impacts of the dredge material disposal? If this helps, I really don't know if this really helps. The point of this is you have to look at, for cumulative impacts, reasonably foreseeable. It's reasonably foreseeable that there are future actions. See, that's the thing on cumulative impacts. You know about past actions. You know about things that are going on now. Now you propose a project. I'm going to, develop a new condominium complex along this beach area here and put lights and people and dogs and pets. Well, okay, you're probably going to take away, 30 acres of turtle nesting and the 300 million acres of Gulf of Mexico turtle nesting. So I say, well, maybe it's not a lot, but then you say, what are the future actions? What are reasonably foreseeable future actions? Well, if you look at past actions and produce linear graphs for future actions, you quickly find out that cumulative impact assessment can really, require you double think your projects. Unfortunately, right now, we're just looking at cumulative impact of sort of like highways. Okay, the highways in the Massachusetts have filled, 12% of the acres of Massachusetts of wetlands. We're only going to fill 1/10 of 1% and we're going to mitigate. But maybe it will help us when we look at cumulative impacts to provide more mitigation, more compensation for various habitat loss now when we do the projects, as opposed to waiting till the turtle habitat in the Gulf of Mexico is lost. So what is the direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts? Well, direct impacts of strip mining. You issue the Bureau of Land Management, I think, would issue a mine permit. Well, okay, the habitat is going to look like that. What are the indirect impacts of wind turbines? There are bird kills, and you're not building this to kill birds, but it's going to happen. And then you say, what are the cumulative impacts? You have one or two, and I think that's the Vermont Ridge. You have one or two turbines, but now you start going down the ridge. Just keep going. All right, when do you stop? Do you have that entire area, that entire ridge covered with turbines? Probably, if the wind's good, that's probably what we're going to do. But I'm not value judging turbines versus solar versus anything. I'm just saying you need to look at direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts of any action you take in the coastal zone. So this is a legal clarification. Nothing much, just if you want to just get it a little straighter in your mind that, how do you look forward on cumulative? So in indirect, looking forward, cumulative and indirect seem to be the same, but so cumulative impacts can be completely unrelated. And it could be impacts on birds from ski resorts, but yet you're issuing wind turbines. So that's that kind of subtle distinction. Not a big deal, but in case that was stuck in your mind. So now this is the most important question you ask in NEPA. Is the impact significant? And that's term significant is very important. So this is legal, technical, and NEPA, this is well established. We break that question into two questions. Is the impact itself significant? Is painting stripes on your parking lot significant versus building a parking lot on our wetlands in the back of Mass Maritime? Well, painting stripes does not seem significant. Building the parking lot does. So the impact itself, the context and the intensity, is it a 1,000-acre parking lot, or did you just expand the parking lot for the locals from 4 to 5 spaces and maybe had to take up a little of the beach dune? So that is, what is the significance of the impact? The second question there, so that there's two questions. What is the resource being impacted? If the resource is the grass, the mowed grass behind Speechmore, then that resource itself isn't significant. If it's the beach dune or the wetlands, and you had to expand the parking lot into the beach dune or the wetlands, well, those are significant resources. We'll all agree they are. Well, now you have to say, well, why do we agree they are? Some people may not agree that the beach dune is significant. Well, the salt marsh is significant. And you'll see that there are institutional definitions of significance, such as the Clean Water Act, which we've studied, that says a wetland is a special aquatic site. So if it is significant because it is identified as a special aquatic site, then your resource itself is significant. So then you go back to one. Is the impact on the resource significant? Is it 100 acres of salt marsh lost, 1/10 of an acre, 1/8 of an acre? If you're in Alaska, 5 acres of salt marsh when they have, 500 million acres may not be significant at all. As a matter of fact, in Alaska, they still let you fill salt marsh. In Massachusetts, you may not fill any salt marsh because we've lost over 50% of it. So go back. Let's assume we have a significant resource for now. All right. So we have a significant resource, whether it's a coral reef, wetlands, uh, vegetated shallow eelgrass bed, shellfish concentration area, shellfish bed. We have all of them, by the way, right at Taylor Point. So it's always funny to me that we have the perfect coastal zone. We have marina, we have developed area, we have uh, area that's armored. Armored means you have big stone on it, which is, right along the road there, along the canal. And then we have several different natural resources that all have significance under the Clean Water Act and other acts. So let's assume we have an action that is going to potentially impact a significant resource. Then we have to look at the context and the intensity. The context and the intensity, funny enough, these two words are being bandied about now. They might change them this year, but let's just stay with these words. The context. What is the location? Even short term, what is the location? Is it Alaska or is it Massachusetts for the salt marsh? Probably the easiest thing when you say context. Intensity, what's the degree of the impact? So intensity is, how big? Is it 1/10 of 1 acre because you just had to shift the parking lot a little? Is it 100 acres of salt marsh lost? Is it a temporary construction impact? Now, when you talk about intensity, that's very important. Obviously, in everyone's mind, 100 acres versus 1/10 of an acre is okay. I get that for intensity, but it's temporary impact to the wetlands during construction is much less intense than a permanent impact. The reason I say that's important, because if you remember the discussion of habitat units when we did the salt marsh mapping, we looked at habitat units and we did something called average annual habitat units. So we looked at the project life and said, all right, so it's going to take 5 or 6 years or 2 or 3 years for the habitat to come back. So we do our mitigation based on average over time. But, it works the other way too. If the impact is temporary over a 30-year project, only 1 year you're going to have those habitat units lost. Then when you mitigate, you only have to really mitigate for, that 1 year's habitat loss over the project life. So intensity means degree of effect, and that includes over time, not just the spatial amount, but, is it a permanent effect or a temporary effect? Here's a good picture of context and intensity. So right up on the top of the, Mobile, Alabama watershed. Mobile River is one of the most industrious coastal zones in the United States. There's a lot of work going there, a lot of oil. There's a lot of oil. There's actually a lot of shipbuilding too, interestingly enough, along the way. So you have to, we need a new bridge. We need a railroad bridge. We need some type of crossing for whatever reason. So the context of that is if you put the bridge in the upper headlands, you're going to have, in that context, you're going to have a lot more impacts than if you put a bridge right next to the existing bridge. You already have a developed area versus an undeveloped area. You're bringing, traffic, whether it's train or truck traffic, into an area that is pristine. You are changing the hydrology of the river, even if it's only a few bridge abutments. Well, maybe, putting another bridge abutment in the lower river there, the lower right there picture is going to be a lot different than putting a bridge abutment in the upper left. So context is really what is the setting And then in NEPA, we call the setting the affected environment. So that's actually a chapter in the NEPA document. What is the affected environment? And then what is the environmental impact? Because you want to consider the context of your impacts. So it's context. Intensity is the degree, and it's whether it's temporary or permanent, or here's another big a big issue down in Florida. I don't know if you know the St. Johns River watershed, but it's a big issue on how much fresh water gets into a coastal watershed, because obviously the more fresh water, the more estuarine area you have, the less fresh water, the more the salt water is going to intrude into the estuary. So looking at a big coastal picture, when you change 20,000 acre feet in an area that only holds 200,000 acre feet, that's a big effect. But you could change 100,000 acre feet in an area that is 23 million and you'll have basically no effect. So you couldn't even calculate it. So intensity is the degree of effect within the context of the affected environment, of what resources you're worried about. So we did impacts, indirect, direct, and cumulative. Now there's another term to learn. It's the lead agency. On the state level, Mass Maritime Academy was the lead agency in building the floating piers. In the bridges over Cape Cod Canal, the Army Corps of Engineers is the lead agency in building the bridges. The lead agency is responsible for several actions, and the first is, whether it's a federal or state level, you publish a notice of intent that you're going to do the project. So you put, for an environmental impact statement, you must put in the newspaper, and the 33 CFR, again, there's the code of federal regulation, the law that we had to put out there because CEQ said you have to do this. You have to tell the public that you're doing it, and it's your responsibility from soup to nuts on a project that these actions be taken in the right order. At the state level, in the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act, they have a publication called the Environmental Monitor. And the Environmental Monitor is exactly the same as the Federal Register when it comes to environmental projects. They didn't want all these environmental projects to get lost, and although they go out in the same section of the Federal Register has EPA looking at it, and so if you're not going to lose some of these impacts. But in the Commonwealth, if every little town put out their notice in a local paper, how would someone be looking at the big picture and the cumulative impact? So the Commonwealth put together the Environmental Monitor. Same concept. The lead agency is in charge of the project. Usually that's the lead agency because that's where the funds come from. Federal Highways gives money to develop highways. They're the lead agency for the NEPA document. Now, whenever the federal government does anything, there's always some state agency and other cooperating agencies. So there's other definitions there we need. But obviously, Federal Highways Administration looks at the big picture of highways across the United States. And they fund, by the way, 90% of all highway costs, all highway improvement costs in every state. So the State Department of Transportation, DOT, they put in 10%. So every dollar they put in, the federal government gives them $9 to help manage and develop safe highways. And because that is very important interstate commerce-wise, and including tourism, but highways, interstates are considered, sort of a federal priority. So no surprise there, but be advised, you all could get great jobs at federal highways because they have a large NEPA and environmental contingent. They have a lot of people working for them doing just what we're talking about. So their words scoping and selecting alternatives. We talked about different direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts. Well, once you have that impact on your affected environment, you'll have to select alternatives. So we'll be there with when we talk about the chapters of the document and how it's conducted. And the scoping activity, the word scoping is coming up, is the public hearings. And we just had a scoping activity for the bridges over Cape Cod Canal last year at the Bourne High School, and also out in Sagamore. Another term, cooperating agencies. Under the National Environmental Policy Act, there is guidance put forth by the Council of Environmental Quality on cooperating agencies. It's a complicated request in federal and state agencies because basically you're being asked to do something, work on something. Let's say Navy is going to do an environmental impact statement on testing some sonar. So you're going to request all these agencies at the state and federal level to work on something to benefit you that A, they might be opposed to, but B, they don't get paid to cooperate. Case in point, the offshore wind turbines, they required a permit from originally the Army Corps of Engineers. It's been shifted to the Bureau of Ocean Energy and Management because they require a lease from Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, BOEM. And so BOEM is asking all these agencies, and let's just take NOAA in particular, to be a cooperating agency on the offshore wind turbine development. Well, NOAA has to realize that that means one of their staff, maybe two, over the next couple of years, more than 50% of their time is going to be working on this environmental impact statement. And what the federal government determined is if you have jurisdiction, and NOAA certainly has jurisdiction over the fisheries under the Essential Fish Habitat Act, Magnuson-Stevenson Fisheries Management and Conservation Act. So NOAA has jurisdiction, and whether they like it or not, out of their own budget, they have to be a cooperating agency on the offshore turbines. Now NOAA is smart, and they know that they want to get ahead of this, and they actually have developed a section, I think it is a section in the environmental branch up in Gloucester, that does specifically offshore energy development, NEPA work. And so now you've got a couple people that are experts at this, and that's the way to do that as an agency. But they could say no, and you know, NOAA's out there to protect the resources. They could say no. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service can be a cooperating agency on the offshore wind turbines, and they have said no. They don't want to be a cooperating agency because there's an awful lot to do, and honestly, their jurisdiction is only under the birds that might be impacted by the turbines. That impact is covered under the Migratory Bird Treaties Act. Basically, it's ducks flying north to Canada to get hunted. So there are going to be about 365 birds killed a year from the turbines. So they said they will handle the environmental concerns of the Department of Interior, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service through the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So when you see cooperating agency, it's a formal process because you really have to know who's going to show up. And a cooperating agency means you're developing a draft environmental impact statement that'll be going out to the public, and these cooperating agencies have their name next to it. That too is not all that much fun because now NOAA's like, well, yeah, we have been at all these meetings. Yes, we've been helping develop this environmental impact statement, but very often you'll see a statement in the record that NOAA only has given advice to the developer or the permitter, BOEM in this particular case, and that until they see public comment in the final environmental impact statement, NOAA is not issuing concurrence that this is the proper project alternative. So there's a lot of disclaimers there, but recognize that besides the normal day-to-day work at all these agencies, you also have to participate in numerous and several NEPA documents from all the other federal agencies and state agencies for that matter. Mass Maritime Academy developed their marina area and the big piers that were built 2 years ago, and the Division of Marine Fisheries, the Office of Coastal Management, The Fish and Wildlife, State Historic Preserve, all those people had to participate at a state level because all those people had jurisdiction. So that's under the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act. There is funding. So if you want to study, and let's say in Mass Maritime Academy had the option of hiring Division of Marine Fisheries to do a shellfish study before the dredging under the Kennedy. They had that option, or they could do it themselves. We did it ourselves. We actually used the Scuba Club, and we sent them down with. I was on deck with some of the science equipment, so they did the sampling right and did the analysis. So we, the lead agency on a project can fund cooperating agencies if they say that's above and beyond my normal review. So there's review, and then there's adding data. So, but normal reviews are supposed to be out of the agency's own budget. It's good to have cooperating agencies on your project because, and don't worry about the those Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act, Planning and Guidance, Water Resource Development Acts. That third bullets, don't worry about it. It's not something you will deal with it. They list them all in Chapter 7. What I'm saying is that if you have all these agencies that have authorities, let's say Interior under the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act, and they're working with you, then you'll quickly realize that you're not going to violate some of these acts. If you have the people that are in charge of essential fish habitat at the table, when you're putting offshore turbines in, then you can kind of at least, they may not agree with you, but they will tell you when you are complying with the procedures or the processes of a particular act. When you go to court, this is where the courts look at the Administrative Procedures Act and said, were you arbitrary and capricious, or did you listen to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service when they said, hey, you have to comply with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act because birds are getting killed offshore? If you said, no, they're not, birds aren't getting killed, that's our opinion, and went on, that is a capricious decision. And that's what the courts look at and say, well, how can you, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, that aren't in charge of birds, tell the people that are in charge of birds, Department of Interior, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, how can you tell them there's no impact? Because you didn't do any studies. Boom, that was capricious. So there's references here, and I just leave these here. I'm never going to test you and say, what did the cooperating agency implementation procedure memo say? Just if you want to follow this more, there's pretty good cooperating agency. There's pretty good legal source on this. It's changing right now. In 2020, I think some of the verbiage is going to change. By the way, if you looked at this PowerPoint, there's a lot of hidden slides for references. Something that'll be available to you in the future. Scoping, so another term. So we've talked about cooperating agencies, direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts, significance, and now scoping. Scoping is public involvement. To me, scoping is full disclosure of what someone's going to do in a project. I've always said the best thing about NEPA, it's full disclosure. Years ago, and this is a true story, when I got hired at the Army Corps of Engineers, there was the old school guys with the cigar in their mouth, white shirt, and a rotary phone on their desk still, and like, yeah, I'm an engineer. And I heard them say, yeah, back in the old days, we used to hurry up and build it quick before the opposition could organize. That's a true statement. The federal government would be out there, go back to the 30s, 40s. I mean, and a rotary dial telephone was the best mass communication there was. People would build things. They built these big reservoirs. They moved towns and flooded, you look in western Massachusetts, the Quabbin Reservoir, there's 2 towns in there. I think there's 80 something buildings that were flooded. And they made a reservoir to store water. Harbors and coasts. Let's dredge the harbor quick and dump it here. And they do that, and basically the dredge would show up, they'd be out, and they'd dump it in an area. The fishermen would come by and say, wait a minute, we fish here. You just covered our fishing area with all this harbor mud, and you wiped out our fishing. So organize quick before the opposition can organize was a true thing. So scoping was a very large and important aspect of the National Environmental Policy Act. They require scoping meetings. And it's good. If you start a project by getting the public involved, then just about when you're ready to build it and someone says, hey, I'm opposed to this, and the courts have very clearly said, and I think I gave you an example of the Kennebec River Bath Iron Works where the Navy ship was going out. The courts even said, hey, why didn't you, when they did a scoping meeting and had all these meetings, put out the public notices, why didn't you write this issue then? You just decided now that this issue's been here. So, I mean, if something unknown turns up, that's fine. But if it's a known issue and it's brought too late to the process, the courts won't stop the project. So it is, you are supposed to determine the scope of the NEPA document by listening to the public. So if the public doesn't bring up concerns about the coastal, white cottontail rabbit population in an area, you don't need to do much. By public, I also mean federal, local, state, and even town environmental people. You're kind of scoping, what are you going to focus on? If the public does bring up the coastal population of cottontail rabbit, then you at least have to evaluate it. You can't arbitrarily say, I just said be capricious, there's no impact. That's not an important population. No, if it's brought up in scoping, you must analyze it. Even if to you, the educated person writing the document, it seems frivolous. It is not, because it came up in scoping. So use it the other way. Scoping is a very important tool where people could stand up and make you focus on, even a small impact, but at least you'll get its due day in court. So an environmental impact statement requires scoping. There's a lower level of and you'll find out soon the relationships between an environmental assessment and an EIS, so EA versus EIS. Environmental assessment doesn't require scoping, but you'll see that once you write the document, you have to send it out for public review. Scoping requires formal meetings ahead of time, where public review is after you've written the document and you're about ready to make a decision. So that's the distinction between public review and scoping. In scoping, you're going to have, you actually have to put in the Federal Register that I am going to do an environmental impact statement. I'm going to do scoping on such and such a date at such and such a time. We just had the scoping meetings last year at the Bourne High School at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and 6 o'clock in the evening. They did these scoping meetings, and they're very formal meetings. You walk in and there's some official sitting at the table, give you introductory remarks, usually a briefing of these contexts. Here's what we're doing right now. Here's the alternatives we know, and here are the impacts we know about. So you usually get a 15-minute overview of the project. For example, the bridges over the canal. And then you go to public comment at the scoping meeting that is recorded by court stenographers, and it's recorded by video now these days too. But there has to be a transcript, and that transcript is available to the public. And every question brought up in the scoping meeting must be answered. And that's something the courts look at. And then also you could send in an email, you could send in a letter during the scoping time frame, and usually you have 30 days to do that. You could send in whatever information you want, whatever concerns you have on any of these topics, and the scoping document will have formal answers. The offshore wind farms had 5,000 comments. 5,000. Think of 5,000 pieces of paper and envelopes. That's why that EIS was shoulder high on me. So you have to answer all those. Usually you have a contractor that'll group all the comments, and you might have 400 different groups of comments, but the first one, well, there's one for aesthetics. So anything that had to do with aesthetics would have to be cross-referenced to the letter received or the comment received in the scoping. Fish, endangered fish, fishing, fishermen. So you are able to group the comments, and very often we would group them under these headings right here. But you have to explain in your environmental impact statement how you answered all of the scoping comments. So now we had scoping, we had impacts, and now we're going to talk about alternatives. So when you do a project, you are going to state what you're going to say, we want to make the, more floats at Mass Maritime. Okay. That's it. You can't just say that's the only thing we're going to do. Or I'm Walmart. I'm building this strip mall and I want to put my parking lot here. And that happens to be where the wetlands are, but that's what I'm doing. No, you have to examine alternatives to your action. So the section on an environmental impact statement is called the alternatives analysis, is organized into these three general categories of alternatives. So this isn't impacts, although it starts looking very much like impacts, cumulative and indirect, but this is alternatives. The first one is the no action alternative. In the future, if there was no project, what would occur? For the most part, the environment is status quo. It probably gets a little better if nothing, or sometimes actually the environment gets worse. And I've done a lot of habitat restoration. In the future, without project condition, as a wetland continues to get overtaken by Phragmites and becomes non-productive, or so the future without project or the no action alternative must be looked at over a project life. Usually project lives are 30 to 50 years. I don't know why. I just think after 50 years we give up. We just can't predict that far in the future. But very commonly for economic return, if you build a seawall to stop flooding in Duxbury Marshfield area, and over the next 30 years, would it prevent enough damages that it's worth building the particular seawall you're going to select? So economic analyses often will go 30 to 50 years. And, the other thing you look at is a town really, if you're going to build that seawall, what you call bond it. You put out you go to the bank and you get a loan. They call it bonding it, but it's a loan. And you pay it back over time with people's taxes, which means you start increasing the taxes immediately when you make the decision to obtain that bond. And a 30-year, just like a 30-year mortgage on a house, 30-year bond is a reasonable or a known quantity economically. So the no action, look over the next 30 years and what's going to happen? What's going to happen if you do nothing? And then you are in a NEPA document supposed to say, well, the purpose of our funding here is to maintain traffic over the Cape Cod Canal, safe traffic, and navigation through the Cape Cod Canal by ships. So the purpose and need for the action is the navigation and continued land transportation. The need is, safety. Bridges are getting old in about 10, 15 years. They are past their projected economic and physical life, which has a couple orders of magnitude. Those bridges will be there. If you did nothing, those bridges would be there a long time. But they need to be wider. They need to be safer. So purpose and need drives the various actions. And the bridges across the canal, their actions are one new super bridge in the middle, expand the existing bridge. Someone that wanted to look at a ferry, more ferry service going to feed the Cape. So those are alternatives. And the no action would be continued navigation through the canal. Ships should be really happy. They're fine with no action. But over time, the deterioration of the bridge would lead to a failure of the road traffic. So that's the purpose and need. So you look at your alternative. You have to look at reasonable alternatives. And the ferry service is considered not reasonable. It just does not have the capacity to replace the bridge traffic. It just doesn't. It doesn't seem reasonable. It was looked at, and so if someone, yeah, there's a little risk there that it is arbitrarily or capriciously dismissed. So I do think they're doing a little bit of an analysis, not a big one, about how many ferry boat trips you would need. I mean, a reasonable person says, yeah, it's probably not reasonable. So then actions by others, uh, you would include that in your no action alternative should also be sort of either way you could do it. You could split it out. I'm trying to think what's a good action by others. It's probably more if we're going to build the marina floats at Mass Maritime Academy. You'd say, all right, well, we have our handful of boats that we use for training for students. Well, if the town of Onset on the back of the campus off their beach was going to put a big marina complex where we could just rent some space and put our boats there, then that action by others, if it was reasonably foreseeable, would need to be included in us expanding our piers. So actions by others, there's on a big scale. Usually, if others could handle the alternative, you would let them do it. But if the lead agencies are probably most times the only people that can take the action, that would suffice. Continuing on definitions and terms, mitigation. So when we say mitigation, everyone thinks, oh yeah, you're going to fill a wetland, so you're going to build a wetland. But mitigation has two statutory directions. One is in NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, and we'll talk about it here. The other is under the Clean Water Act. And remember we said in the Clean Water Act, you must select the least environmentally damaging practical alternative. And you must avoid, minimize, and then compensate for any adverse environmental impacts. So that was under the Clean Water Act. So you're all familiar with that. NEPA says the same things, and it was a little different time, a little different wording, but there was some cross-referencing of this. Mitigation should be described in NEPA, but it is not required by NEPA. So you're describing and fully disclosing your adverse environmental impacts and then the efforts taken to avoid, minimize, or compensate for them. Well, let's talk about avoiding, minimizing, and compensating. Those are the three terms I stick with. There are other terms, but let's just stick with them. Avoiding means you don't have the impact. If I'm Walmart, I avoid filling salt marsh in the coast for parking lots by making my parking lot 2 stories high. I avoid dredging Plymouth Harbor and disposing on the beach during nesting piping plover time by a environmental window. I don't do it during the nesting piping plover time. So avoidance is always good to define. And you need to define it. I mean, people are going to say, well, why didn't you do this dredging in January, February, March, and April when I'm not at my beach house? Because I stay at my beach house right through November. Well, the reason is we are avoiding nesting piping plover habitat. Minimize is how small should the footprint be? So I guess I said Walmart by making a 2-decker parking lot was avoiding. It's probably minimizing it more than avoiding. Avoiding would be Walmart does not put their parking lot in the wetlands at all. Minimizing means you look at the footprint, you look at the depth and the side comes, but I guess it all comes to the footprint. You minimize the impact, and that's usually just good design. If you don't need to dredge your turning basin 20 acres, you only need 10 acres. You know, even though you're there and it might be nice to have a bigger marina, well, you can minimize. And most people think of mitigation in the term of compensation. Before you get to compensation, there's two more words out there, and don't worry about them. Rectifying and reducing. Both of those are what we call, they're sort of, I loop all of them into minimization, and it's minimization by good project design. And when you talk about minimization, you know, reducing or eliminating the impact, you know, during the life of the action, or, you know, rectifying it by, so minimizing the impact in general, minimize, rectify, reduce, or eliminate. So if you have a temporary road, you know, minimize that by removing it, right? When construction's done, you remove it. By the way, a lot of temporary roads have been put in and people say, no, let's leave it. I like that road. So you have to be very specific in your NEPA document and remove the road. Compensation, and that's the one that most of us are familiar with. When you say mitigation, I want a marina and I am going to dredge 3 acres of eelgrass. To do that in Massachusetts, you'll probably have to plant, you know, actually I think right now they want you to plant 30 acres of eelgrass. But you have to compensate. You have to replace or substitute. And that's why we did the salt marsh habitat units. You need to compensate. And when you say compensate for a habitat loss, you say, well, how much? 1 to 1, 1 to 2, 3 to 4. So we boil it down to habitat units. And then we say average annual habitat units, because over time, it's going to, you know, you build a salt marsh today, it's not going to be a fully functioning salt marsh till a year or so. If you have a temporary road, your habitat units are temporary. You know, if you have a 2-acre temporary road through the salt marsh, you don't need to build a 2-acre compensatory mitigation over the life of the project. You probably, if it's a 30-year project life, you 2/30ths, right? You know, or well, depending on how many acres and how many years you take it out. So compensation is very expensive. If you are federal highways, you have people that just deal in mitigation banking. We talked about that in the Clean Water Act, but they deal with, okay, we know we have this highway, and 10 years from now we'll have this highway built, and we'll start in about 5 years. But we know the lowest amount of wetlands we're going to, you know, go across or fill for bridge abutments along the coast, or, you know, let's say we're going down the Cape. The least amount of mitigation we need is X, and then you just X habitat units. Then you start developing your compensatory mitigation. So mitigation has avoid, minimize, and compensate. It's not required by NEPA. It'll be required under the Clean Water Act. And obviously if it's endangered species, there's mitigation. So each law itself would require the mitigation. NEPA says you have to fully disclose the avoid, minimize, and compensatory mitigation. And yeah, just a note, and it's someone gave me this once. It says, once we plant these palm trees, who will know the difference? When you do compensatory mitigation, it reminds me to tell you, besides habitat units, the mitigation has to be of the same quality, the same habitat lost, and it should be in the same watershed. And that is a big issue, especially when, let's say, you go from here to you know, Chatham with a new road. You're going to go through many watersheds. So it's probably incorrect to assume I could do one big mitigation here at Mass Maritime and build our salt marsh out and say that's good. No, it's the, you know yourself that each of those watersheds has valuable habitat, you know, valuable biological community. By giving Mass Maritime more wetlands does not help compensate for the loss of a road going through, Chatham Stage Harbor area. So in the same watershed is a very important concept. Now, so this is a detail in life. So we're doing environmental impact statements. And I don't know, it really, yeah, it's not that big an impact. Maybe, maybe we shouldn't do an environmental impact statement. Maybe if we do the right amount of habitat unit compensatory mitigation, it's not a significant adverse environmental impact. It doesn't meet that significant test we just talked about. So that's possible. That's a possibility. And this is Council of Environmental Quality 40 frequently asked questions, number 39. You don't have to read them, but if you get into NEPA, you will be reading them. The Council of Environmental Quality says if you have adequate compensatory mitigation, well, adequate mitigation, if you've avoided, minimized, and then you have adequate compensatory mitigation, you don't have to do an environmental impact statement. So with NEPA, you could bring the significance of the impact below the level of significance. You really can't do that with the Clean Water Act, the least environmentally damaging product alternative. But in NEPA, you can. So if you have a project and you do everything right, maybe you don't need an environmental impact statement. And you're seeing nowadays, and if you notice the numbers of EISs have trailed off through the decades, you're seeing nowadays that compensatory mitigation, a lot of agencies, highways in particular, Forest Service in particular, they'll give extra compensatory mitigation just to avoid doing an environmental impact statement. Because an environmental impact statement is going to take you a couple of years. So no matter what, you're slowed down to that pace. So if you could build it quicker, faster, better, and right now say, yeah, we're just going to commit to extra mitigation, it might be within the agency's worth. Actually, as a matter of fact, when we did Mass Maritime Academy, it was very clear that if they needed to do any compensatory mitigation and to get it built faster, that we would jump right in on that. So in doing compensatory mitigation that reduces the environmental impacts from an environmental impact statement down to just writing an environmental assessment, it's a simpler document, it's called a mitigative environmental assessment. So just this is not a term I think you need to know. This is sort of where we get to a little bit more of the, maybe this here documents for if you get a job in this field, but mitigated environmental assessment is, like I said, the way most federal and state agencies are going right now. They want to stay away from big environmental impact statements. So then there's another guidance out there, and I think right up to now we have the bigger concepts under our belts. I'm going to go a little quicker on these. There's something called adaptive management, and a lot of you probably have already learned this in other classes. But if you're going to build something, especially an environmental project, like I'm going to build a wetlands, or you're going to build a storm damage reduction project, a big wall or the big tide gate across Boston Harbor like the Dutch did. By the way, we have we have New Bedford hurricane barriers, so tide gates and hurricane barriers are not out of the question. But if you're going to build something big and long term, there's something called adaptive management. And with the not knowing for sure what sea level rise is going to be, adaptive management, monitoring, and mitigation are the way we are going to develop projects in the coastal zone. We know there's more severe storms. We know tidal heights are higher. So when you build storm damage reduction protection, the current mindset in the coastal zone is to do adaptive management, monitoring, and mitigation. If you're going to build a beach dune to stop along the Jersey Shore, which they are doing that, they're to stop the tidal surge, the 11-foot tidal surge on top of a lunar high tide for Hurricane Sandy, then you're going to build that beach dune 11 foot above that extreme tidal height probably 2 feet for, good engineering clearance. So you're going to build it to 13 feet. And people say, you know what, but that's assuming sea level rise is only 3 feet. What if it's 6 feet? Well, that's where in your documentation you do adaptive management, monitoring, and then future mitigation. Because building that extra 3 feet right now is mitigating for an impact that cannot occur. That 6 feet of sea level rise is in 2100. But between now and 2070, pick a day, you're not going to have that sea level rise, and what you're building is adequate. Then you make your coastal designs. This is very big in coastal zone management now, to be able to be modified in the future, the future environment. So that's adaptive management. When you say modify, you're monitoring it and you say, okay, yep, we built it to 12 feet. And let's just think of the New Bedford Harbor hurricane barrier. If we built it right now and it's been functioning, we built it in the 60s, right? So it's been functioning perfectly. And that was overbuilt. Engineers back then, they built it so waves don't splash in the harbor. That was kind of funny because by doing that, they actually built it to accommodate sea level rise. And there's no issues. They overbuilt it. Nowadays, you have to look at that overbuilding of, boy, that's a lot of money now. And maybe we could build that, modify that in the future and save all that money. And maybe, we're going to make sea level rise adaptation, adaptive management, and we're worried about 11 feet. Maybe it's going to be 15 feet. Maybe it's going to be 16 feet. So we can optimize it in the future. And that way the public investment now is protected by not building it now. So there's a lot of that in the coastal zone. There's a real lot of that in the coastal zone. Another term, tiering, just so you know, the tiering is when you have a big regional environmental impact statement. They are finishing this in Long Island Sound. They have a regional dredge material disposal site tiering effort. They have 4 big dredge material disposal sites in Long Island Sound. So once those sites are designated, then you can go ahead and dredge New Haven Harbor deeper, which they're doing, and do an environmental impact statement to dredge New Haven Harbor and tier on the existing dredge material disposal site EIS. And that way you don't have to duplicate everything that was done in that EIS. When you're looking at broad scale efforts in the Gulf of Mexico, let's say oil leases, when you're looking at offshore wind turbines, this one they still haven't done, which I very strongly recommended they did it. They still haven't listened to that one. There should be, by Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, a programmatic environmental impact statement for all the offshore leases on the eastern seaboard. And then each lease can do their own individual site-specific NEPA document tiered on the programmatic. So tiering is another term that jumps in, just so you know, is a programmatic analysis that on a broad level, and then when you come in to do your own site specifics, you do your site specific, you tier your site specific NEPA document on the broad document. So I think we may see it for the eastern seaboard wind turbines. They should do it because there's a lot of activity. And then emergency actions, just so you know, if there is an emergency, and you always hear the federal government has declared a national emergency, it's a federal national emergency. If there's an emergency, you could take action to protect or build back anything in the coastal zone that was already authorized. So in an emergency, if we had a severe storm come through and it wiped out mass maritime piers and docks, and let's say even the boulders along Cape Cod Canal, if all that got jumbled up, and after Hurricane Sandy, there were 81 breakwaters and jetties in New England that got moved. And if you looked at Nantucket, it was Nantucket Harbor, I think it was. Yeah, it was. There's a great picture of before Sandy was a nice day beacon, green light on a post. Not post, a metal superstructure, sort of like a small lighthouse. After it was at a 30-degree angle to the side. The whole thing moved. So that's what breakwaters and jetties are supposed to do. They armor the coast. They protect harbors from waves. And in a severe storm, they move. Well, you got to put them back. Well, we would be able to, in an emergency under the National Environmental Policy, um, build back anything that is, you know, safety. That sort of like those sea walls or even the piers along the Mass Maritime shoreline. We could build them back if they broke in a storm. And you don't need to do NEPA. You don't need to do MEPA. And you'll see this in the paper after a hurricane, but you only have a 1 or 2 year window. Each state will make your own decision, but you don't need permits. They're called emergency actions. You go in and do it. After Katrina, there was 3 years of what was called NEPA emergency actions. And, you know, when you have to build a $2 billion Mississippi River Gulf outlet hurricane barrier, so the Mr. Go, Mississippi River Gulf Outlet, look that one up. It's a huge structure. It's actually modeled after the New Bedford Hurricane Barrier. They came up and looked at the New Bedford Hurricane Barrier and saying, hey, we're going to build just the same thing, just at a bigger scale. But that was done without the NEPA process. There was a team of NEPA experts from the Army Corps, NOAA, Fish and Wildlife, Coastal Zone, EPA that were working, and the NEPA document can be done concurrently or thereafter the emergency action, and that's what all this says here. So that's typically how we would do it. There's a lot of different acts. So the Public Law 8499 is the one that the federal government declares a disaster. Then money comes from federal government to fix all of these seawalls, breakwaters. Highways gets money to put roads back. Bridge abutments get repaired. All of that is the Public Disaster Law 8499. And there's other laws out there that do the same thing. So that money can be spent. Remember, you can't take an action without NEPA. That money can be spent under the NEPA emergency action provisions. If there's not a significant impact and the time frame is over, I don't really just not worry about this too much. But if there's no significant adverse environmental impact, you could still do it, but you have to accomplish concurrently or just after the project's done. You have to write an EA. You have to write something for the record that said we could do this. Being honest, most projects we do, if we lost the pier at Mass Maritime, it'd be 6 months to a year before we built it back to what we want. I mean, there's always temporary, put some rocks in front of it. But I always kind of get, well, it's not really an emergency action if it's 2 years later. But the law says you can do it concurrently or do your NEPA documentation afterwards. The Hurricane Katrina, if you want to see what they did, New Orleans district there, Hurricane Katrina New Orleans district, had a tremendous analysis of 40 CFRs on how to do an emergency action. So it's a nice reference out there, nice research project. So we're now at the middle of, or I think you've got the background of the National Environmental Policy Act, and I think you know what the terminology is. The next section is going to be on the process, and by the end of that, you say, yeah, I could do an environmental impact statement. But let's just take a couple slides here for some takeaway points. Scoping is extremely important. The scope of the document, remember that, sets the scope of the document. The public gets involved early on with scoping. This is done before you put out any real document. This is supposed to be done before you start writing. And also before you start writing, get the cooperating agencies. So now you have the public and those people with experts working on your environmental impact statement. We define direct, indirect, and cumulative. And just remember the cumulative is, basically all past, existing, and foreseeable future impacts, direct and indirect. Significance, context, and intensity. First of all, that's what NEPA talked about. But first, you have to have a significant resource. Is the resource have significant? Is it a parking lot or is it a coral reef? Context and intensity is, is it a, uh, are we in Alaska with a tenth of an acre of salt marsh, or is it Massachusetts? By the way, Massachusetts does regulate 1/10 of 1 acre of salt marsh. And actions can be um, connected. I guess that's kind of the new term for direct and indirect or cumulative. So, and then mitigation is avoid, minimize, and compensate. I know the law says avoid, minimize, rectify, reduce. Minimize, rectify, and reduce. I always just remember the words mitigation. Oh, avoid, minimize, or compensate. So if someone says, oh, we got to discuss mitigation. In your mind, you should say avoid, minimize, or compensate. Because avoiding with a seasonal window is probably the most popular type of mitigation there is. Compensatory mitigation is expensive. Talk about emergency action just now, but remember the monitoring and adaptive management. In your careers, always think about monitoring and adaptive management if you're doing something in the coastal zone. Because we don't know what the coastal zone is going to be like, and all the indications are, yeah, oh yeah, severe storms. Look at this, look at the last couple of years of storms, and that was, people said, oh yeah, and we're hitting some worst case now in the coastal zone. What if in 20, 25 years it's a lot worse? Where I guess the opposite of that is what if it's a lot better? I don't see that, but it is possible, I guess, So adaptive management, all right? And you monitor what you do and make decisions to change in the future. If you're working in the coastal zone, you've got to consider that. It costs a lot of money to build stuff. We have had some projects, though, that have looked at the dollars and said, you know what, for 10% more, we can, be protecting the 500-year event. That means there's a 1 in 500 chance it'll occur in a year for 10% more of a 1 in 100 chance. And people say, you know what, we're going to invest the money. So that's as long as you do that as a conscious decision and it's not, oh, we didn't do it, forgot to do it, or we did it, but we didn't have to. If it's a conscious decision, I suppose it's okay. So monitoring and adaptive management. And I think we'll stop it right there.